June 18th, 2022. 6:12 in the morning. Just outside Salina, Kansas, the fields didn't look like they belonged there anymore. The storm had passed hours earlier, leaving behind a cold that shouldn't exist in mid-June. A strange kind of silence sat over the land, the kind that comes after something has already gone wrong. Ethan Cole stood at the edge of his wheat field boots, pressed into damp soil, hands still at his sides. From a distance, it looked like a normal crop, but up close, something wasn't right. The heads of wheat weren't golden. They weren't even pale. They carried a faint gray-purple tint, like the life had been pulled out of them. Overnight, some stalks bent unnaturally. Others stiffened in ways wheat wasn't supposed to. Ethan reached out, broke one between his fingers, and rolled the grain in his palm. Hard, too hard, not dead, but not right. He didn't say anything. Didn't curse, didn't call anyone. He just stood there, looking across the field that had taken him an entire season to grow. And something in his expression didn't change, because he had seen damage before, but not like this. A pickup truck slowed on the dirt road behind him. A neighbor leaned out the window. "Frost got you too," the man called. Ethan didn't turn, just nodded once. The truck idled for a second longer, then drove on, because there wasn't anything else to say. By 7:30, word had already started to spread. Late frost, out-of-season cold snap, crop damage across the county. But Ethan's field was different, and that difference was what would change everything, because what most people saw that morning was failure. But what Ethan was holding in his hand was something nobody there understood yet, and that was the beginning of the problem. By 10:15 that same morning, Ethan was standing inside a small agricultural office just off Highway 81. The room smelled faintly of paper and dust. A few other farmers stood along the wall, holding samples in plastic bags, waiting their turn. At the center of the room stood Dr. Michael Grant. Clean shirt, clean hands, clipboard in front of him. The kind of man people trusted, because he had answers. Ethan stepped forward and placed his sample on the table. Grant picked it up, turning it under the light. He didn't need long. A few seconds. That was enough. "Frost damage," he said flatly. He set it down like it no longer mattered. "Kernel structures compromised. Protein breakdown likely. This isn't going to pass inspection." Ethan didn't respond. Grant glanced at him briefly, then added, "You should plow it under." The words landed without weight in Grant's voice, but they carried something heavier in the room. A quiet finality. A man standing nearby shifted slightly. "Same thing happened to mine," he said. "Lost the whole south field." Another nodded. "Nothing you can do with that." Ethan stayed where he was, still, looking at the sample. Then he spoke. "I'm still going to harvest it." The room went quiet for a moment. Then someone let out a short laugh. Grant didn't laugh, but he did look up again. "You'd be harvesting unusable grain," he said. "It won't sell. It won't mill properly. It's not fit for standard processing." A grain buyer standing near the back stepped forward, arms crossed. "Won't even make feed grade," he added. "That kind of damage. We reject it." He looked directly at Ethan. "You'd be better off cutting your losses." A few heads nodded. Someone near the door muttered, "Or save yourself the diesel." That got a small ripple of quiet laughter. Not cruel, just certain, because to them, this wasn't a debate. It was obvious. Ethan looked at Grant again. "Have you tested this exact strain before?" he asked. Grant frowned slightly. "Wheat is wheat," he replied. "Damage is damage." That answer settled it for everyone else. Ethan picked up his sample, held it for a second, then nodded once. Not in agreement, just acknowledgement, and turned to leave. Behind him, the grain buyer shook his head. "He's harvesting nothing," he said under his breath. Another man added, "Maybe he just doesn't know when to stop." And that was the moment it happened. Not the frost, not the damage, the dismissal. Because in that room, they didn't just reject his crop. They rejected his judgment. But there was something none of them had asked. Something none of them had checked. Because if they had, they might have noticed that Ethan Cole wasn't growing the same wheat they were. And to understand why that mattered, you have to go back long before that morning, long before the frost, back to a piece of land that didn't behave the way people expected it to. The Cole farm had been in Ethan's family since 1946. It wasn't the best land, never had been. The soil held moisture longer than it should. It compacted easily. It didn't respond well to standard planting cycles. Farmers who tried to work it the same way they worked other fields usually failed. Ethan's grandfather learned that the hard way, 3 seasons in a row. Low yield, poor quality. Neighbors told him to switch crops or sell. He didn't. He changed something else. The seed. Instead of using the same commercial strains everyone else relied on, he held on to an older variety, something passed down from his own father. A wheat that didn't produce as much, didn't grow as fast, didn't look as uniform, but it did something else. It adapted. It didn't fight the soil. It worked with it. Ethan grew up watching that, not as a lesson, as a reality. His father never explained it in technical terms, never talked about protein structures or genetic variation. He just said, don't try to make the land behave. A pause. Listen to what it's already doing. Ethan didn't understand that when he was young, not fully, but he remembered it, especially in the barn. Late in the evenings, when his father would run his hands through a bucket of grain, feeling the texture instead of measuring it. Most people look at yield. His father once told him, they forget to look at what they're actually growing. That stayed with him. Long after his father was gone, long after most of the neighboring farms had switched entirely to high-output commercial wheat, Ethan didn't. He kept the old strain, year after year, even when it didn't make sense, even when it made less money, because it wasn't just seed. It was something that had already survived things. Modern crops hadn't. And that was the part nobody in that office knew, because while they were looking at his wheat, they were seeing it through their own standards, their own assumptions. But what Ethan was holding that morning wasn't behaving the way their wheat would, and that difference was exactly why they got it wrong. Ethan didn't go home and sit with it. He didn't walk the fields again trying to convince himself they were wrong. And he didn't start tearing anything down. Instead, the next morning, before most of the town had even finished talking about him, he did something that didn't fit the situation at all. He started the combine. The engine came to life slowly, the same way it always had. No urgency, no hesitation, just a steady, familiar rhythm. From the road, a few trucks slowed down, not because harvesting was unusual, but because harvesting that field, well, he's actually doing it, someone said from inside one of the trucks. Another replied he's wasting fuel. And maybe from the outside, that's what it looked like. Because the crop didn't look right, didn't sound right either. As the combine moved forward, the wheat didn't break the same way under the header. It resisted slightly. Not brittle, like dead grain. Not soft, like immature growth. Something in between. Different. Ethan noticed it immediately. He adjusted nothing, just kept going, row after row. The machine filled slower than usual. The grain tank didn't rise with the same golden shine it normally would. Instead, what collected inside muted. Strange. And by mid-afternoon, the rumors had shifted. He's harvesting it all, not just testing. All of it. The grain buyer drove past once, didn't stop. Didn't need to, because in his mind the outcome was already decided. There was no market for that wheat, no buyer, no purpose. But what nobody understood was this: Ethan wasn't harvesting for them. He was harvesting to see, and that difference mattered more than anything else. By the end of the second day, the entire field was cut, stored, not sold. That was the part that confused people the most. Because even if the crop had some value, holding on to it made no sense. Cash flow mattered, timing mattered, and yet Ethan sealed the grain in storage bins and left it there. No calls, no contracts, no negotiations, just waiting. What's he doing? Someone asked at the diner that week, waiting to prove he was right. Another replied, but that wasn't it, because Ethan wasn't trying to prove anything. He was trying to understand something. And that began in a place no one else thought to look. 3 days after the harvest, Ethan took a small bucket of that wheat and drove 20 miles south to an old milling facility that most commercial operations had stopped using years ago. It wasn't efficient, didn't run at scale, but it still worked. And more importantly, it still allowed for small batches. The man who ran it, Carl Benson, had known Ethan for years. He looked at the grain once, then looked at Ethan. "You sure about this?" Carl asked. Ethan nodded. Carl didn't argue. He poured it into the system. The machine started up the slow grind of stone against grain, filling the room with a sound that hadn't changed in decades. And then something changed. Carl noticed it first. He leaned in slightly, watched the output. The flour didn't fall the same way. It didn't disperse into that soft, light dust most wheat produced. It came out heavier, denser, with a slightly different color. Carl rubbed it between his fingers, paused, then looked at Ethan. "This isn't breaking down like it should," he said. Not as a warning, as a question. Ethan stepped forward, took a handful, felt it. The texture was wrong, but not in the way Grant had described. Not weak, not degraded, structured, holding together differently. That was the moment something shifted. Not outside, not in the town, but inside Ethan's understanding of what he was holding. Because damage doesn't do that. And whatever this was, it wasn't behaving like damage. Carl ran another batch, slower this time, adjusting pressure, watching closely. Same result, different breakdown, different consistency, different smell, subtle, but there. "What did you grow this year?" Carl asked quietly. Ethan didn't answer right away, because for the first time since that morning in the field, he didn't have a simple answer. And that was when he realized something important. This story wasn't about whether the wheat was ruined. It was about whether anyone had ever actually understood it in the first place. Ethan took the flour home that night. Didn't call anyone. Didn't tell anyone what he saw. He just set it on the kitchen table and left it there until the next morning. At 5:40 a.m., before the sun had fully come up, he started again. Not with machines, with something simpler. Water, salt, heat. He mixed the dough slowly, by hand, feeling it the same way his father used to run grain through his fingers. At first, it didn't behave the way wheat dough normally would. It resisted, held its shape longer, took more time to relax. Ethan didn't rush it, didn't force it, just adjusted, watched, waited, because there was something happening in that dough, something he couldn't explain yet, but he could feel. And that was enough. By the time the first loaf went into the oven, Ethan already knew this wasn't going to be what they expected. But what came out of that oven was something none of them had ever seen before. What came out of that oven didn't look ruined. It didn't look damaged. It didn't even look unusual at first glance. It looked deliberate. The crust formed darker than expected. Not burnt, but rich deep brown, with a faint tone beneath it that almost carried that same gray tint Ethan had seen in the field. He let it sit, didn't cut it right away, just watched the steam rise slowly from the surface, the way it always had when his father baked in that same kitchen. Then he picked it up, heavier than it should be, not dense like bad bread, structured. He cut into it. The blade didn't glide the way it usually would. It met resistance, not hard, but firm. The inside opened slowly, revealing a crumb that was tighter, more elastic, with a color that wasn't white, wasn't tan, something in between. And the smell, that was the first thing that told him everything had changed. It wasn't weak. It wasn't flat. It was deeper, almost nutty, but not quite. Ethan took a piece, held it, didn't eat it right away, because in that moment, he understood something that nobody else had even considered. This wasn't damaged wheat. This was something else entirely. And what happened next was the part nobody expected. He didn't call Grant, didn't go back to the buyer. He drove to a small bakery in town instead, a place run by a man named Luis Herrera, who had spent most of his life working with dough, not in large factories, not in industrial systems, but in small batches where difference mattered. Luis looked at the loaf, then at Ethan. "You made this?" he asked. Ethan nodded. Luis cut a slice, took a bite, and for a second, nothing. No reaction, just chewing, slow. Then he stopped, looked down at the bread again, then back at Ethan. "Where did you get this flour?" he asked. Ethan didn't answer right away, because the question itself was already the answer. Luis took another bite, then another. "This isn't standard wheat," he said quietly. And that was the moment the shift began. Not loud, not public, just one person, recognizing something. Luis started experimenting with it. Different hydration, different fermentation times. Every batch came out different, but not worse. More expressive. The structure held. The flavor deepened. The dough behaved in ways modern flour didn't. Word spread. Quiet at first. A baker telling another baker. A small mention in a local group. This wheat, it's different. But there was something nobody had confirmed yet. Something that needed to be understood at a level beyond taste. Because the more people tried it, the stranger it became. Within 2 weeks, a sample of Ethan's wheat ended up in the hands of someone who didn't care about local opinion. Dr. Helen Strauss, food scientist, specialized in grain protein structures. She didn't know Ethan, didn't know the story. She just received the sample and tested it. At first, the results didn't make sense. The protein structure wasn't broken. It was altered. The gluten chains were shorter, but more interconnected. The enzyme activity wasn't degraded. It had shifted, responded, adapted. Helen ran the test again, then and again. Same result. She sat back looking at the data, then said something no one in that room expected. This shouldn't exist like this. That was the moment everything changed. Because what they had called damage wasn't damage. It was transformation. The cold snap had triggered a response in a wheat strain that most modern agriculture had already abandoned. A strain that didn't react the way newer ones did. A strain that didn't break under stress. It changed under it. And suddenly, what had been labeled unusable became rare. Not just locally, nationally. Within a month, Ethan's wheat wasn't sitting in storage anymore. It was being requested. Specifically, artisan bakers wanted it. Small mills wanted it. Researchers wanted more samples. The price didn't just recover. It multiplied 3 times, then more. And the same grain buyer who had stood in that room and called it contaminated was now calling back, asking, negotiating, trying to secure a contract. Ethan didn't rush, didn't push, didn't change his tone. He just listened, the same way he had always listened. And when the deal finally closed, it wasn't just profitable. It was something else. Proof, not that he had been right, but that they had been wrong. And that difference mattered. Back in town, people stopped laughing, stopped making comments, because now they had seen it. The same wheat, the same field, the same man. Nothing had changed, except their understanding. Grant heard about it last, not from Ethan, from someone else. He saw the reports, read the analysis, saw his own words, reflected back at him. Unusable. He didn't say much after that, because there wasn't much left to say. A few weeks later, he drove out to Ethan's farm, parked by the field, walked up slowly. Ethan was there tracking the next planting. Grant stopped a few feet away, looked at the soil, then at Ethan. I misjudged it, he said. Simple, direct. Ethan nodded once, not in victory, just acknowledgement. Grant looked out across the field again. That wasn't damage, he said quietly. Ethan shook his head. No, he replied. A pause. It just wasn't what you were used to. That was it. No lecture, no explanation, because Ethan wasn't trying to prove anything. He never had been. And in the months that followed, nothing about him changed. He didn't expand aggressively, didn't switch to mass production, didn't chase the market. He planted again, the same way, the same strain, the same patience, because to him, the wheat hadn't become valuable. The world had just learned how to see it. People like to trust what they recognize, what fits into their systems, what matches their expectations. And when something doesn't, they call it failure. They call it damage. They call it useless, until the moment it proves them wrong. And by then, the truth has already been there the whole time. Because sometimes, what looks ruined is just something the world hasn't learned to understand yet. And the people who see that first aren't the loudest, aren't the richest. They're the ones who stayed long enough to listen